the link very early. And I want to believe that the students are where we are supposed to be having a class at 9. So I think I'll start. Whoever wants to join can join in as we move on, so that we do not waste time for those who logged in early enough. Let me save those users. So last time we looked at the endogenous compound histamine, and I did explain that when we look at the drugs we are calling the antihistamines, they will be going for the same receptor as the endogenous compound histamine. So it is important for us to understand that compound histamine as the endogenous compound that binds that receptor, so that also we through that we can be able to extrapolate what kind of structure we expect for the antihistamine. Of course, the structure will have the compound will have structural similarities with histamine to be able to identify or bind the same receptor, but it will also have some structural differences, because remember, the antihistamine is not an agonist like histamine. The antihistamine is an antagonist. It is supposed to bind the receptor but not elicit any activity, because as we said earlier, most of the effects of histamine are actually injurious. They actually are negative. So in understanding, just as we understood the compound arachidonic acid, and in understanding arachidonic acid, we were able to kind of understand what kind of compound you'd expect to actually bind the same receptor as bound as arachidonic acid. It's the same thing we are looking at. Understand the endogenous compound, then structurally modify the structure of the endogenous compound to get compound that can effectively bind the receptor and give you this either agonist activity or antagonist activity. And always remember, antagonist activity is where the compound does not elicit. It does not stimulate the receptor. It binds the receptor, blocks it from being bound by the agonist, and therefore there is no pharmacological activity. When we were looking at this structure of histamine, we did mention that there is some stereochemistry. We mentioned about the gouge. We did mention about the Sohos and the Newman projections, where we did mention that you can have the gouge conformer. When you look at the trans, you can have the trans or the gouge conformer, and that conformer is where it's also known as a staggered conformer, where the groups are farthest, the big groups are farthest from each other as much as possible. They are not on the same side, and that is a conformer of histamine that is required for binding of the receptor. So we did mention those conformers, and we were able to draw them both using the trans and the gouge. We were able to draw them using both the Solman's and the Newman's projection. As I said, if you go back to your organic chemistry, you will see that even when we look at compounds that are attached through single bonds, they can rotate. The groups that are attached, especially if the groups are of different sizes, those rotate around the single bond, and therefore they can give us different conformations. These ones, normally we call them conformations. They can give us different conformations. You can have, like what we talked about, the trans, or even you can have what we call the gouge conformer, which, as I have said, is you can have the gouge, you can have the trans, which the trans is the same as the staggered, or you can even have what I believe you looked at earlier, what you call the eclipsed. The eclipsed is where the big groups are lying on top of each other, which has most steric hydrons. So you can have those different conformers, and those different conformers are just representing the different groups, the different bulky groups being at different positions, and depending on the positions in which they are, you will have different amounts of steric hydrons. Remember, steric hydrons can influence the way that molecule is going to approach the receptor, because you must understand that the receptor is also surrounded by atoms, surrounded by groups that can also have their engagement, and therefore there can be repulsion. Sometimes the one which is slim, the molecule with minimum steric hydrons, is the one which approaches the receptor best. And we did say the trans conformer is the one which binds both H1 and H2 receptors, and that's what we're interested in. We also did mention that histamine in the body can, and it's a base, and of course the aliphatic amine will be always protonated at physiological pH. It will physiological pH, and once it is protonated, that means it will have a positive. It will go for a receptor, most probably where there is a negative charge, just as we looked at the arachidonic acid and indeed the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. So the histamine will be protonated at physiological pH. We expect it, or we expect the receptor to be anionic or to have a negative charge, whereby the histamine and the anionic charge, or the receptor, which is negative charge, will have some interaction through ionic bonds. So these are some of the things that by now we should master, because they'll come again and again and again. The type of drug you have, you should be able to look at it and be able to see what kind of interactions would you expect, or what kind of groups would you expect on the receptor which you bind that compound, so that compound is well fitted on the receptor in order to trigger a pharmacological reaction. Remember, when we talk about pharmacological reaction, it's just that the drug or the compound onto a certain receptor and triggering or stimulating that receptor to release other compounds that bring about physiological activity. So now we had gone up. I think now we can look at the classification of the antihistamines. And initially we classified the antihistamines according to generations. And just as we looked at the penicillins, the generations just represent when the drug was synthesized. And of course, the earlier generations, more often than not, have lesser potency, often than not more toxicity than the higher generations. We can classify histamines into first, second, and third generation. So that is the first classification, first generation. And when we look at the first generation, these are the ones we call the classical antihistamines. And these classical antihistamines, again, we will classify them into other subgroups, quite a number of subgroups. And the one of the disadvantages of this, the first generation, is that they do have a lot of toxicity, especially sedation. They cause a lot of sedation. They will also have a bit of anticholinergic activity, anti-adrenergic activity, but the major side effect is their sedation. And their sedation can be well explained by the fact that they have high lipophilicity, and therefore, because of their high lipophilicity, they can penetrate the BBB, get into the brain, and unfortunately, when they get into the brain, they bind the receptors to bring sedation. So that's the first generation. As I have said, we will further classify the first generation into various other subgroups. Then we have the second generation. The second generation is supposed to be non-sedating. And if it is non-sedating, it means also it will have lower lipophilicity. It does not penetrate the BBB very effectively, and therefore does not get into the brain and causes is non-sedating. It has also less anticholinergic and also anti-adrenergic effects. These anticholinergic, anti-adrenergic effects, of course, you've looked at them pharmacology, they can be very disturbing. So of course, the drug will be better if it has almost no anticholinergic and anti-adrenergic effects. It has low lipophilicity and therefore less CNS toxicity. Then we have the third generation, and usually the third generation are usually derivatives of the second generation. Either you have isolation and you have the more pure, or you have the one of the isomers. You see, when we look at these drugs, we also find chemistry is very important, and you can have the R and S isomer. So more often than not, you find that the third generation can be either the more active enantiomer. Remember, you have the R and S enantiomer. So one of them might be more active, so you might have it as a more active enantiomer, or for some of them, it is the more active or the active metabolite. And of course, these drugs have much, much higher efficacy and much lower side effects, because there will be no need of synthesizing a newer generation which does not have advantages over the lower generation. So the higher the generation, we expect the higher the efficacy, the higher the potency, and the lower the toxicity. So as I had said there, we go back to the first generation. And the first generation, again, just as we looked at the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, again divided into many, quite a number of subclasses, about 6 subclasses. And the first generation is what we normally call the classical antihistamine. it is further divided into several groups. You have group A, which we call the ethylene diamines. And if you look at it, it is this ethyl group here. There is this is what we're calling ethylene, and then diamine, because it has 2 nitrogens. So we have not bothered to mention the diphenyl group. So ethylene diamines, that ethylene group, which is a spacer, or which is a joining or the link between the 2 nitrogen, and then it has those 2 nitrogens. And as we are going to see, there are several examples: pyrilamine, tripenamine, fenbenzamine, antazoline, and donzelamine. We're going to look at their structure, but we're saying basically they will have that kind of structure. They have this connecting atom, and their connecting atom is nitrogen. When we look at these different classes, we see that the connecting atom can change. It can be a carbon, it can be a carbon, and it can be also a nitrogen, or it can be a CO. It can be a carbon, can be a nitrogen, it can be a carbon, or it can be a carbon oxygen. So for the first class, where the connecting atom is nitrogen, is where we are talking about ethylene diamines. Then you can also have the second category, is the ethanolamines, or what we call the aminoacyl ethers. We are calling them ethers amino. That is aminoacyl ether. So that's where they're deriving their name, or ethanolamines, aminoacyl ethers. And the aminoacyl ethers are actually isosteric in diamines. It is only where, of course, in place of the nitrogen, we have a carbon oxygen. You can see there is this carbon and that oxygen. So in place of the nitrogen, you have a carbon oxygen replacing the nitrogen, but of course also having good antihistamine activity. So under that, you have the diphenhydramine, dimenhydrinate, doxylamine, carbinoxamine, and clemastine. We're going to look at them one by one. And if indeed you look at your printout, although I'm just mentioning them, I've given you a printout, and I hope you have printed it out. If you look at that printout, you will see the drug we are talking about. We started with the ethylene diamines. And I think the ethylene diamines, if you have paginated your handout, you see on page 3. On page 3, you see on page 3, you have the structures of some of the drugs I've mentioned there. You can see the structure of pyrilamine. Pyrilamine is the first one. You can see the structure of also methylpyridine, tripenamine, donzelamine, and antazoline. You can see all those structures they had been drawn for you. So those are some of the examples. And then I think on page 2, you have the ethanolamines. You can see the structures. If you look out there, you will see the structures of diphenhydramine, dimenhydrinate, carbinoxamine, and doxylamine. So all those, again, what we are noting, and of now what is important is to note that the different classifications are dependent on what our X is, even before we discuss the SAR. Then we have the alkylamines. You can see the names are derived from the kind of side chain you have here. The alkylamine is where our X, the nitrogen in the ethylene diamines, is replaced with a carbon. So you can see now here the phenyl rings are separated with 1, 2, 3. So here the phenyl rings are separated from the terminal nitrogen with 1, 2, 3. If you look at the other ones, there is definitely a different atom, but the separation is by 2 carbon atoms. So like if you look at the ethylene diamines, you find that there is that nitrogen. So that, of course, these groups, the phenyl rings are actually, of course, there is this separation of the nitrogen, but you have only 2 carbon atoms in between there. So that's the main difference, that for the propylamines, you do not have a heteroatom. For the propylamines, you have a carbon, and therefore directly the terminal nitrogen is separated from the phenyl groups by 3 carbon atoms. But for all the others, you do have a heteroatom in between. And here is where we have phenyramine, and the very, very popular drug we call chlorpheniramine is what you call Piriton. I believe almost everybody has taken a pill. I believe everybody has taken a tablet of Piriton, either for allergy itch, either it's like you are itching or something. I believe all of us have taken chlorpheniramine, and that is, of course, the scientific name of Piriton. Then you have brompheniramine. As you can see, the difference between that one and this one is that one has a bromine, the other one has a chloro group. And then there's triploridine. When we look at the alkylamines, we will go further again to another subclass, whereby we will say the alkylamines can either be saturated or unsaturated. The ones which are saturated examples are phenylamine, chlorpheniramine, brompheniramine, and then we have these two, triploridine and pyrobutamine. This have got unsaturation. All that means that this hydrogen here is lost, and between this carbon and that carbon you put a double bond. The alkylamines or propylamines, calling them propylamines because 1, 2, 3 propyl group. Propylamines or alkylamines can either be saturated or unsaturated with retention of activity. Remember, when we bring in unsaturation by now, it means we can also introduce geometric isomerism where you can have cis and trans isomers. Again, we look at that. Then we have this example. When you look at this compound, phenidamine, phenidamine is where this alkyl chain is part of a ring of activity. Again, I think we have that structure. Just look for those compounds.
Excuse me, Daktari.
Yes.
Did you send those structures?
I sent this. Yes, I did.
Which handout is that?
I sent this handout last time.
Oh, we did not receive that one.
You didn't receive?
The one with antihistamines, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me look at my... I sent last time. Let me see. Sent messages, just 1 minute. I think they went to the wrong. If I send them, will you be able to see them? But you cannot be able to log in and see them in your phone. Eh? Will you be able to see them in your phone? Oh, I've seen. They went to the wrong. They went to the wrong address. Oh. So what can we do? Can I send them? Let me send them. I'm so sorry. What happened? They went to the wrong address.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just send them. Oh. JK, what? I don't know how they went to the wrong place.
Hey, what's up, TikTok? So I got a question for all my straight girls out here. Why in the holy hell do y'all play gay when y'all drunk? Because I'm not understanding. I'm not the one to be fake gay with, okay? One night I was out with my friends, right? Homegirl gets a little lit,
Check
right?
whether you've received them.
I'm sitting at the bar.
Yes, we have.
You have, yeah. Imagine they went to the wrong email, but I didn't check. So I hope you'll be able to use them together. See, all right. So are you able? Yeah. Or how will
Not
you
at
be?
the moment.
So we can just continue.
Yes.
You will be they will be of help.
Yes.
I know the structures are also on the structures will also be on the notes, so you will be able to see them. It's only that now here I'm just doing a summary, and then I'll look at each and every class. So I hope that will help. Okay. Sorry about that. So we were saying that, okay, so all these compounds, I was saying phenylamine, these two are anphenylamine, chlorpheniramine, brompheniramine. Chlorpheniramine is unsubstituted. As you can see, there is phenylamine in both of them. Phenylamine is the unsubstituted moiety. Chlorpheniramine means it has a chlorine somewhere. Brompheniramine means it has a bromine. Then I've said trifluridine and pyrobutamine. These two have unsaturation, and that's what I was explaining. When you look at this structure, you just remove this hydrogen. You remove this hydrogen, and you remove one hydrogen here. You put a double bond there. So the trifluridine, pyrobutamine are unsaturated. Phenidamine is where this is part, as we have said earlier, of a heterocyclic ring with retention of activity. So that is group C. As I said, there are quite a number. Then you have the group D, and the group D are what we call the cyclizine. Cyclizines or piperazines. Piperazine derivatives are where you have this ring here. You have a six-membered ring with two nitrogens which are para to each other. So this is a piperazine ring, unsaturated ring with two nitrogens para to each other. That is the piperazine, and that is what they are deriving. That's where they are deriving their names from. Cyclizines just means they are cyclic, so they are actually piperazine derivatives. And you have the examples here. We have cyclizine as a prototype, and as you see the others, chlorcyclizine means it is a substituted cyclizine, hydroxyzine. We also are going to see it, meclizine, buclizine. You can see meclizine means it has a methyl somewhere, and then buclizine means it has a butyl somewhere. Those are the main ones we're concentrating on. So that's all we want to understand. If you look at this drug, if you look at the one we started with, phenbenzamine, although one of these was a benzyl ring, it still had these bulky groups, but joined through a nitrogen. So this is joined through a carbon, which is now joined through a piperazine ring. Part, if you look at this, we are seeing our terminal nitrogen and even part of the archaeal chain, again, are part of the piperazine ring with retention of activity. So those are the piperazine derivatives. Again, note the two phenyl rings are joined together and then joined to the piperazine ring. So those are the piperazine derivatives. Then we can also have the piperidine derivatives. All we are doing here is just changing the ring. And if you look at the piperidine derivatives, if you look at this, these are now tricyclic: ring 1, ring 2, ring 3. When these rings are fused together, 3 of them, they are tricyclic. So this are tricyclic derivatives or piperidine rings, because you can see, again, they are joined. So again, we must always look for the terminal nitrogen, because all these compounds must have a terminal nitrogen. That terminal nitrogen is part of a piperidine ring. A piperidine ring, again, is a 6-membered ring with only one nitrogen. So that is a piperidine ring. So they are part of the piperidine ring or piperidine ring, and we have compounds like acetidine, cycloheptadine, and ketotifen. Again, we're going to look at them. We can also, when you look at this ring here, when you look at these structures, we will see that if you look at this ring in middle here, you see you have this. If you want to try and compare this with the ethylene diamines or the propyl, more appropriate with the propylamines, because they're attached to a carbon, if you remove this section here, you will have your phenyl ring there, then joined by a double bond there. So indeed, more resemble the unsaturated propyl derivatives, So if you look at this connecting ring here, you can see it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It has 7 members. So it's a either a cycloheptene or a cycloheptane. When it has, like this one, this has an unsaturation, so that is a cycloheptene. When there is saturation, then it's a cycloheptane. We can also call this structure here dibenzo cycloheptene or cycloheptane. Dibenzo 1, 2, dibenzo for the benzene rings, dibenzo. And then this ring here, as I have said, in some of these compounds, it will be saturated. In others, it will be unsaturated. When it is saturated, you can call them cycloheptane. When it is not, when it's saturated, you can call them cycloheptane. When it is, you can call them cycloheptenes from alkenes. It is an alkane or an alkene. Then I have also tried to explain that when you look at this compound, don't look at it and see the structure is very complex. It's not very complex because it has similarity with the propylamines. Because look at, just ignore this double bond, block this. If you block this, or in your mind you remove this will be a phenyl ring. This will be a benzene ring. This will be a benzene ring attached through a carbon. Attached through a carbon. So the second carbon here is part of a piperidine ring with retention of activity. So please note that indeed they can also be considered as structurally similar with the propyl or the alkylamines. They are very, very similar with the alkylamines. Again, if you note, you can see here you have that is a carbon which is joining, then you have 1, 2, 3. So they do have that carbon. They have a slightly longer chain. That is with the carbon which is joining, 1, 2, carbon joining there, 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, we did mention anytime you have an atom as part of a ring, there is constraint. So even if you have a slightly longer chain, that compound can still attain the necessary distance to bind the receptor. So they are structurally similar to the alkylamines. Then from there we go to the phenothiazines. Again, the phenothiazines, as you can see, they're also tricyclics. They are also tricyclics. It's only that the in-between ring, the in-between ring is like a thiazo ring. If you like, it is a thiazo ring. The in-between ring is a thiazo ring. It has a sulfur and a nitrogen. Again, if you compare this, just compare this in your minds with the ethylene diamines. Again, block this sulfur there, please. Block that sulfur. If you block that sulfur, again, you will see a phenyl ring, and they are joined through a nitrogen by 2, the ethylene chain, as we had said down about ethylene diamines. So they are structurally, so the phenothiazine derivatives are structurally similar or have structural resemblance with the ethylene diamines. The piperidines have structural similarity with the alkyl or propylamines. And as I've just said, you just block this here. If you block that group there, then you will find that that is a benzene ring. That's a benzene ring attached through a nitrogen to the ethylene chain, and then the terminal nitrogen. So those are the ones we call the phenothiazines. So note the phenothiazines is where the 2 benzene rings are attached through a sulfur. The piperidine rings are having what we of course called the cycloheptane ring or cycloheptene ring, but of course having a piperidine ring attached, of course, through unsaturation. So that is the structural similarities which you can also derive from from those structures. So those are mainly those about I think either 5 categories. Those are the categories that represent the classical first generation antihistamines. We look at them one by one. Then you have the second generation antihistamines. Again, they are derivatives of the first ones. So once you understand the first ones, then there is nothing new. Of course, the structure might be different, but we are saying generation are derivatives. They are derivatives of the same compounds that we had, the same basic compounds, like you have the ethylene diamines, like you have the compound acrivastine, for which we look at the structure, but it's an ethylene diamine. It will have other substituents, but its basic structure, it is an ethylene diamine. Then you have the piperazine, where we had the cyclizine, and we have cetrizine. And cetrizine, indeed, we will find is a derivative hydroxyzine. Cetrizine is a derivative of the hydroxyzine, and we are going to see the structures and how they compare. So you can see, so we are not getting anything really new in terms of the basic structures. The structures of the respective compounds could be different, but the basic structure is different. Then you have the phenothiazines, where you have mequetazine as an example. So of course the structure of mequetazine is different from the structure of promethazine, but both of them are phenothiazines. That's what we need to understand. Again, we have the piperidine derivatives, just as we had said, which are tricyclics. Under the piperidine derivatives is where you find loratadine, tafenadine, astemizole, levocabastine, ebastine. So again, we look at all these different structures. All we need to appreciate is that they are piperidine derivatives. So we are only saying that the second generation are still compounds which have similar structures as the first generation, but of course they have some structural additions which make them different. Lesser, they have better affinity for the receptor and lesser toxicity. Then we have the third generation, and we did mention that the third generation are either metabolites or a specific isomer of the second generation. And if you look at that again, they still have the similar structures, like you have the piperazines, and the piperazines, you have levocetrizine. So under second generation, we had cetrizine. So now you have levocetrizine, where levocetrizine is the levoisomer. If you look at this drug here, this carbon to which the two benzene rings are attached, will be a chiral center, of course, if one of this is substituted. So you must substitute one of the benzene ring. If you have these two benzene rings there, this is not a chiral center. It can never be a chiral center. But when you substitute one of these, let's say with a chloro group, with a methyl group, when one of those groups is substituted, then this carbon is a. And once you get the levoisomer, when you look at the structure of cetrizine, the levoisomer is the one which is a third generation, better activity, lower toxicity. Then you have the piperidines and you have desloratadine. Remember, we did mention loratadine as a second generation. Now the desloratadine is a metabolite. The desloratadine is a metabolite of the loratadine. So it's a metabolite of loratadine. So therefore, that gives us that compound. Then you have we have also the other one, fexofenadine, which is I believe it's a metabolite of tafenadine. So tafenadine, fexofenadine, a metabolite of tafenadine, desloratadine, a metabolite of loratadine, and we said this, and of course levocetrizine, the pure isomer of cetrizine, and therefore that fulfills the description we gave the third generation antihistamines, either metabolites of second generation or one of the pure isomers, which gives us the better activity. Again, the basic structure, we are still repeating the same basic structure. They are either piperazines or they are piperidines, but we look at the specific structures as we move on. The genesis. Let me first of all leave that. Okay, the genesis, you have it slightly different from what I have here, but it still means what you have in your handout, but it still refers, it's still the same, very slight, very slight difference. So you have this compound we call the piperoxane. The piperoxane is a dioxane. Remember last time you said the dioxane is where you have this ring which has two oxygen. So you have the phenyl ring joined to the, and here it can either be a piperidine ring or it can be an aliphatic group. So you can also remove this and you have NCH32. It doesn't matter. It can either be a piperidine ring for this, like what you have in your handout is where this is an NCH32. That's what I've given you, but it doesn't matter. It will still produce the same. So the piperoxane was the precursor for this drug. So the piperoxane was converted into the ethanolamine. It was converted into the ethanolamine. That is an ethanolamine, because an ethanolamine is a derivative of an amine and an ether. You can see you have an amine there and an ether. Of course, this had minimal antihistamine activity. So again, it was structurally modified to give you now the ethanolamine antihistamines. So all that was done. There was a little bit of structural modification, increasing the bulkiness, because it was found when you have that bulky group in binding that receptor and giving us antihistamine activity. So you can see from that group there, the structural modification to get the aminoacyl ethers, all the proper ethanolamine antihistamines was addition there's a bit of structural difference. I mean, structural modification, an addition of a second benzene ring or phenyl ring. And of course, when you get the two phenyl rings, you must join them with a carbon, but you can still see that group is still retained. And those are the amino alkyl ethers, which were found to have very activity. This also was converted to propyl alkylamines or propylamines. So you can see propylamines, well, again, making it more bulky, and of course, adding a second ring, making it more bulky, because that was found to be responsible for even higher activity. It was also changed into the ethylene diamines, where again, the same story. You're making it more bulky and you're retaining a connecting atom. You're retaining a connecting atom. As I said, it can be a carbon, it can be a nitrogen, or it can be the carbon, the CH. You can see there's a CH oxygen there. So that was, there is increase in bulkiness, and of course, retaining one of those atoms, a heterocycle, one of the atoms, either a carbon or an oxygen or nitrogen, for maximum or optimal activity. Then the ethylene diamines, as we have said, can also be converted to the piperazines. You can see the ethylene diamines converted to the piperazines, and we have discussed the piperazines, the cycle, which we also call the cyclizines, and they were also found to have good activity. Then the ethylene diamines again could be converted to the phenothiazine, because it is just here. You put here and you put an S there. That's all that was done. Up, you put an S. So they were converted again to the phenothiazines. We do have specific phenothiazine, like promethazine has very good antihistamine activity. The phenothiazines also, now they were found that they could be structurally modified, and when we look at antipsychotic drugs, you find the phenothiazines. Well, again, the phenothiazines were the precursor molecule for the synthesis of the antipsychotics, like chlorpromazine. So the only addition of a chloro group was in a particular position, gave us the antipsychotic, and then also gave us the tricyclic antidepressants, and the tricyclic antidepressants were also converted to the tricyclic antihistamines, and this is where piperidine derivatives, like azatidine, the ones with ketotifen, azatidine, and so on. So all we are saying is that there is an interconnection. All these drugs originated from the same source. It was just a matter of structural modification to give you the compound, different compounds with structural similarities, and of course also structural differences. And because of the structural differences, they were able to bind the receptors differently. They had differences in their lipophilicity, and once drugs have differences in their lipophilicity, they will have differences in their pharmacokinetics. They will have differences in their ability to penetrate the BBB, and therefore will have differences also in their toxicity. Let us mention SAR.